from Harry. Hello, Harry. And also AES from Amsterdam. Koichi-san from Japan, Daniel from Germany, and a whole lot more. We have, we're joining it's a really very huge crowd today. So this is our agenda for today. We will start with a JUIC introduction for our policy activities in Asia. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box or the chat box at Zoom and the comment box on live stream sessions. We will have time for the questions after the presentation. JUIC's mission is to develop new markets for the wind industry and accelerate the global wind energy transition. We do this through policy development, working actively with national associations, key partners, and our members. Our first speaker, Ms. Liming Kiao, the head of Asia of JUIC, will provide you an update of our policy activities. Liming's current focus is on wind energy policy. She had been working closely with the wind industry to promote a better policy environment for the wind sector in China and other parts of Asia. Liming pioneered JUIC's work in new Asian markets like Mongolia, Vietnam, Thailand, and Taiwan. Liming has been working in the field of climate and energy since 2003 with a focus on renewable policy and international climate policy. Everyone, well, let's all welcome Liming.
Thank you, Eileen. Thanks everybody for joining us, and also thank our co-host Wood Mackenzie for starting this webinar series, this edition with us. Eileen, can you show my slide?
Yes, Liming.
So first, I'll do a quick introduction of JUIC, who we are. For those who are JUIC member, you already know us. JUIC is the Global Wind Energy Council, where the Wind Energy Trade Association level. And we are quite active through our policy advocacy work, covering the whole global. And our different policy advocacy work is done through our different task forces. And the one that is active in this region is the Southeast Asia Task Force, which we'll talk about in details a little bit later. JUIC also do market intels. Some of the statistics you will be seeing today is produced by our market intels team. We also do collaborations, capacity buildings with the government, and also summit and conference for the Asia and also other places. And our Asia flagship event, including Vietnam Wind Power and Global Offshore Wind Summit, Japan and Taiwan, which I think we met a number of you through all these different business matchmaking and summit and conferences. Next, please. What I'm going to talk today is actually one simple message, which is about the global net zero ambition and what wind will play, the role of wind energy in that whole picture in the next few decades. So 2021 is the year that we see the highest consensus being reached on the net zero. And we've seen that 64% of the global GHG emission is now being covered by the net zero commitment. However, even though such a high consensus has been met, the current already announced action is only able to lead us to a global temperature rise of 2.7, which is far short from the 1.5 degrees centigrade target that we need to be. And so what is wind role in this? Next, please. This page shows the life cycle emission of different energy technology. And we can see that wind energy, both onshore, offshore, is actually at the lowest end on this whole spectrum. And even the lowest among the renewable energy technologies. And this is the kind of like the basics of where we're starting on the messaging today. And also because of this extremely low life cycle emission, that's why wind energy and its role has been recognized by different global institutions, especially in the last year, and which was reflected in their different reports being published in the year of 2021. Next, please. The two reports published last year, which reflects this global net zero kind of like consensus. One was from IRENA, which is the World Energy Transition Outlook. The other is from IEA, net zero by 2050. Next, please. And on this report, we can see that 80% of the solution shaping successful outcome for the net zero by 2050 require renewable energy in the direct supply. And also by 2050, electricity will increase from 21% in 2018 to 50% in 2050. And electricity will also become the main energy carrier. And sectoral barrier will also be shifted, which means that electrification will start to enter into the other sectors like transportation, heating, and industrial sectors and other sectors. And this means that the annual growth of the renewable energy technology will likely to see to be eightfold increase in the next few decades. Next, please. And in those two reports, we've also seen historical consensus on the primary role of wind energy in the global energy system in the future. And we also see the numbers of forecast of wind by 2050 is highly convergent in these two reports by these two leading global energy institutions. IRENA is calling for 8,100 gigawatt of onshore and offshore wind by 2050. Where the IEA number in the same time frame is about 8,200. And if we look at the VRE's total share by 2050, is about 63%, where half of that is coming from wind. And that's very similar to the IEA forecast, 70% and half of that from wind. And IEA further have an estimation of the 2030 annual market, which is about 390 gigawatt, including 80 gigawatt of offshore wind by 2030. Let's bear these numbers in mind because we're going to revisit these numbers later. Next, please. And this is from the GWEC report that 2020, we see a 93 gigawatt of annual installation, and the cumulative global installation reached 743 gigawatt. And the offshore wind industry reached 6.1 gigawatt in 2020. And the installation number for 2021 will be released next month by GWEC. Next, please. And this is the next 5 years forecast, where we can see that the average for the next 5 years is about 96.4 gigawatt, and which represent about 3.7% of growth in the next 5 years. And what does this mean for the if we compare this with the global net zero ambition? Next, please. This is an exercise of putting what we have showed you on the IEA and IRENA report on the global net zero ambition of how much and wind energy should be installed in the next every year in the next few decades. And the green bar in the front of that is according to our estimation or our forecast in the next 5 years, which is based on the action that is already been taking place or announced by the government, where you can see a huge disconnect on the ambition and on what will happen with the current actions already being put into place. Like if we look at the 2025 number, the net zero ambition required the annual market to be 192 gigawatt by each year. But where we are based on the current action is only 110 gigawatt, which is a bit more than half of that. And if we look at the 2030 number, what is required by the IEA is 390 gigawatt by 2030. And where we are is only 185, about half of that. And that gap shows where we are and really calls for this climate emergency approach to national policy makers. I'm not going to read all the list of the things that need to be like implemented to fulfill that gap. But I just want to highlight this to all of you who are in the wind energy industry to show you that this is the gap that we, the wind industry people, need to be filled in the next few decades. And that's the ambition that is lying before us for us to really make this gap smaller and shorter with our different efforts. Next, please. This is to a kind of a slide to show where we are in the Southeast Asia kind of context. We've seen that in 2020, most of the East Asia countries, China, Japan, Korea, has already committed to net zero by the middle of the century, which by that time was a big news, because before that, we've seen net zero only being discussed or being committed by the European country, but one by one, in end of 2020, we see that being shifted and that whole concept of being accepted by the Asian countries. And then the next year, we see Taiwan joined, and all those are like East Asian countries, the more developed kind of Asia, parts of Asia. But started from last year, that kind of like, yeah, impact started to be felt in the East Asia, in the Southeast Asia. Last year, this two pictures shows the Vietnamese prime minister went to the COP26, where he announced the the 2050 net zero target for Vietnam, which was the first one to make such a public announcement in Southeast Asia country. And then we see Indonesia have a plan on 2016 carbon neutrality, and similar plan being planned in the Philippines. And also on COP26, we've seen the Coal to Clean Energy Power Transition Statement, where we've seen Vietnam, Philippines, and Indonesia, all the signatory countries. These are all the positive signs and really shows the momentum is really happening in the whole Asia. East Asia to start with, but also Southeast Asia is catching up really, really fast. Next, please. And then that will bring us to this page, which is our Southeast Asia Task Force. That's one of the most active kind of lobby group or the organization that is very active in the region to promote the wind energy deployment in the region. And we're quite active in 4 markets: Vietnam, Philippines, Thailand, and in Indonesia. And these are our members, and our different activities or policy advocacy work were organized through our Southeast Asia Task Force, and also different working groups active in all these countries. So if you're interested in playing a bigger role in the region, or to understand how the policy processes or the dynamics is being shaped by the industry, you're welcome to join us. With that, I'll conclude and hand over to Eileen and the great panel today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liming, for that presentation. I'm looking for any questions out there. But if you have any further questions to Liming, feel free to send later on. So for our next presenter, I'd like to introduce to you Robert Liu. Robert is a principal analyst of power and renewables at Wood Mackenzie. He's here to present offshore wind energy dynamics in Asia. Robert has over 10 years of analyst experience, having worked on research functions in New Zealand, Thailand, China, and Singapore. He has expertise in market intelligence, strategy planning, analysis, forecasting in wind power sector in Asia Pacific. So welcome, Robert.
Thank you, Eileen. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay,
loud
great.
and clear.
Thanks. So yeah, thank you for the introduction and also for the Global Wind Energy Council for organizing this webinar. So I'm glad to be able to share today Wood Mackenzie's outlook on the offshore wind sector in Asia Pacific. So for today's presentation, I'll be giving an overview of the market dynamics. So we want to take a look at the pipelines, the costs, and also the recent developments in key markets in the region. Next slide. Next slide, yep. So to begin with, let's start by looking at how Asia Pac offshore wind compares with the rest of the world. So here we have our Q4 10-year outlook for new added capacity. So China, you can see by far, will continue to be the largest market and will add more capacity than all other regions. But what is interesting to note is the number of active offshore markets in each region. So for Europe, we expect at least 10 active markets, but in Asia Pacific, it's just over half that. But as offshore wind development picks up in Asia Pacific, I would not be surprised, to see even more markets getting involved. So already we are seeing early pipelines being planned in Australia and the Philippines. So it's likely that we will see the share of non-China Asia Pacific markets continue to increase. But overall, the trajectory of global offshore wind is still in the growth phase. And we expect that new added capacity will double by the end of this decade. Next slide. So we see this growth of offshore wind, and that's really being driven by a changing energy mix in the region. So currently, renewables, including both wind and also solar PV, it comprises about 20% of all power capacity in the region. So fossil fuels still take up the largest share with about 60%. So Asia Pacific is actually still lagging behind in the global energy transition. But as more governments, we see them adjusting the national energy plans to be less reliant, on fossil fuel and aim for more ambitious net zero targets, we do see a major reversal by 2050 with renewables, backed by energy storage to replace the current, 60% share of fossil fuels. So this will in turn, relegate fossil fuel to 20% of the energy mix. For wind power, that means, developers must add almost 2,000 gigawatts of new capacity, which is roughly 250,000 new turbines that need to be installed in the coming decades. Next slide. So if we now take a look at the cost comparisons by 2030, so here we have the average cost of all the different technologies that we expect to play a key role over the next decade in Asia Pacific. So you can see onshore wind is already quite competitive with gas power, and prices will continue to come down as it approaches coal power costs. So offshore wind, we think is going to take a bit more time, but by 2030, we do expect that average offshore wind costs to start to approach gas power costs. Now, in any case, even with the higher costs, we do expect offshore wind to be competitive, compared to pairing fossil fuel plants with, carbon capture storage. So in our power service, we have the breakdown of all these technologies for every year, extending out until 2050. So this is just a quick snapshot of the next decade. Next slide. So if we take a longer view until 2050, then it gets a bit more interesting. So we can see that range of offshore wind costs, and that will start to narrow. So we can see costs becoming very competitive in the long run. But at this stage, offshore wind becomes the most cost competitive out of all the premium energy technologies. So first, it will start to outcompete gas power around 2035, and then nuclear power in the early 2040s. And then eventually, even with average wholesale power prices and also hybrid wind storage systems. But currently, there's a wide range of offshore wind costs across the entire region. And then, that's really due to, low costs in China, driven by economies of scale. And on the other hand, we have East Asian markets, which are just starting out, and they still lack economies of scale. Next slide. So next, let's look at the largest offshore wind market in Asia Pacific and what drives growth in China. So last year was really an outlier for offshore wind in China. We see that new added capacity almost tripled year over year. A lot of it is really due to, expiring feed-in tariffs. So we see the surge of activity. That's especially in Jiangsu and Guangdong province as developers rush to complete projects. Starting from this year, we do expect, new capacity to be range bound, between 6 to 8 gigawatts every year. And then we can see that slowly moving up to 10 gigawatts by the end of the decade. As we see more development activity in other provinces such as Zhejiang, Fujian, and also Shandong. Next slide. So if we want to have a look at what happened in more detail, so if we start from the left, we can see that, developers will stand to gain significantly more revenue if they can grid connect projects by the end of last year. So if projects were partly connected or will complete connection post 2021, they will need to rely on on-grid coal tariff, and that will be on average 44% lower than the 2021 central subsidy. And in the middle, we can see that there is a huge pipeline, of 48 gigawatts of permitted projects from 2018 to 2020, and that over 30 gigawatts will be unable to receive feed-in tariff subsidy, even with the record installation last year. So one way for developers actually to rush their projects was to really increase the number of vessels being used. So our China wind team estimates that, up to 19 vessels were used at the same time. But going forward, I think there will be a bottleneck, as there will be limited vessels that can install the larger next generation offshore turbines, which we see already being used in the rest of Asia Pacific and also Europe. Next slide. So in a unique market like China, where developers are almost all state-owned and have an incentive to meet political targets for top management to be promoted, we need to look at the targets as a major driver in the market. So in the latest 5-year plan to 2025, so these are the key provinces that are designated as primary offshore wind markets, and that forms the early steps in the long-term goal, of reaching carbon zero by 2060. So right now, there's actually no national offshore wind target for 2025, so that's still to be announced. But we can see that, some provinces have already, released interim provincial targets. So again, having such government targets is a key driver, given that most development is done by large state-owned companies. So currently, only Guangdong province has awarded enough capacity to meet their local target. But, we are seeing a rapid growth in early stage projects being planned, which, if realized, will be likely more than enough to meet a national offshore target when it is released. Next slide. So let's turn our attention now to the other markets in Asia Pacific. Next slide. So over the next decade, we will finally start to see some sustained growth of between 1 to 5 gigawatts of new capacity added every year. So this is largely being supported by markets in East Asia, so namely Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. So these markets will see yearly growth volumes between 3 to 5 gigawatts once we pass 2025. Now, in the short to medium term, we can see a rush of nearshore intertidal projects in Vietnam, and that will start to ease off and then return in the later half of the decade in the form of more mainstream offshore projects like those in East Asia. And it's also likely that we will see new projects in Australia and the Philippines come online at the tail end as well. But all in all, we can see that offshore wind is still a growth market in the rest of Asia Pacific, and we expect, a compound annual growth rate of almost 30% from now until 2030. Next slide. So the good news here is that, macro drivers for offshore wind are still quite strong in East Asia. So these markets, primarily, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, there is a growing recognition by these governments that they need to increase the share of offshore wind generation as part of efforts to improve energy security. So East Asian markets are really lacking in natural fuel resources and have to rely, over 90% on fuel imports. So that means they have to pay a very high price if there is instability in global fuel markets. So the good thing is that these markets are mature economies and they can afford to pay for the initial high cost of electricity generated from offshore wind. So in fact, we estimate that by 2030, almost a quarter of all renewables in these markets will be from offshore wind. So that reflects the importance of this technology. And also on the right, you can see what's more, there's also a very urgent need to replace aging coal plants and also public pressure to decommission nuclear power plants. So fortunately, only offshore wind has that comparable scale to the size of coal and nuclear power plants. So we are talking about, power plants that can reach upwards of, 1 gigawatt in capacity or even more, and they can also perform at a higher capacity factor. Next slide. So if we now compare the pipeline of projects against, the national offshore wind targets, we can see it's already over 220 gigawatts. So that is more than enough to meet, 4 times the current target in the region. The wild card, of course, being Australia. So the offshore pipeline there continues to grow. And, as of last time we checked in Australia, even though there's no operational capacity, it's the pipeline there is now over 25 gigawatts. And this is not, intertidal projects that we see in Vietnam, but actual mainstream offshore projects. So it's promising to see, momentum continue to grow. But in our forecast, we think that there are still areas that can be improved and to really accelerate, offshore wind to meet these very ambitious targets, especially in the policy support measures. And that's where, Global Wind Energy Council can support. So we expect that at the very least, we will hit half of all the combined offshore wind targets in Asia Pacific. Next slide. So another driver for offshore wind is also job creation and competition to build an industry cluster. But it's easier said than done. So even in markets which do not have local content requirements, there are indirect requirements for localization and also preference for local companies, especially for large government contracts. So this can help gain more local support, but at the same time, it also makes it harder to accelerate development since it actually takes longer to build up that local capability, and that can delay cost reductions. But sometimes, the market can surprise, and that brings us to what really recently happened in Japan. So during the latest, offshore wind auction in Japan, local conglomerate Mitsubishi, they achieved a clean sweep, winning all 3 projects on both counts of price and localization. So many people were surprised by how low Mitsubishi bid, given that, offshore wind costs in Japan are some of the highest in the world. So in our analysis, we don't think that it's really driven by the growing trend of, corporate power purchase agreements or trading of certificates, since the upside is still quite limited. But actually for us, the primary driver is most likely due to 3 factors. So first, we have the economies of scale and also the very strong bargaining position of having a single winner across all contracts. And the second, Mitsubishi, they can access lower cost financing compared to other local bidders. The company is a well-established conglomerate and it has close banking and also political connections. So lenders actually feel more secure to finance their projects compared to other local companies, which might be perceived as higher risk. And also third, Mitsubishi is also able to leverage its experience overseas and also strong local reputation and network. And you can see how aggressively they are bidding, even compared to the second lowest bid. But that also brings up, very high expectations. Next slide. So I'll end by showing our estimates on how far Mitsubishi will have to bring capital expenditure costs. down. So I think it's great that, offshore wind prices are coming down faster than the market anticipates. But, if we compare to current costs, and we are using this Akita Noshiro Port project, which is under construction as a comparison, Mitsubishi will have to really aggressively find ways to cut capital expenditure costs by almost half if it wants to secure, about 10% returns. So we're not saying that it's impossible, but it will require, higher performance and also further cost pressures on the supply chain, which is already under strain in the current environment that we see with rising commodity and also raw material prices. So that I think will present, major challenges in the next few years leading up to the start of construction. Next slide. Finally, I just want to give a brief introduction about Wood Mackenzie. So we are a global leader in commercial intelligence for the natural resource sector. So for nearly 50 years, we have provided data and analytics that covers the entire value chain from raw materials, such as metals, minings, chemicals, leading to the entire spectrum of power technology, ranging from fossil fuels to renewables. And this includes also emerging sectors such as green hydrogen and ammonia, battery storage, electric vehicles, and of course, offshore wind. Next slide. To support this, we have actually created a product called Lens Power, and we believe it's the asset valuation standard for the power market. So clients can use it to strategically position the company for the energy transition, maximize investment opportunities, and also minimize risk by validating strategies against our data and models. And you can quickly search for a specific project and get all the key information, including geographic and power plant details. Next slide. So what's more, we keep adding new features, and now it includes, financial analytic tools that users can compare and edit metrics, such as, levelized cost of electricity, the internal rate of return, cash flow, revenue, operating expense, and also power generation, all, in a very simple interactive online interface. So these models can be edited so that users can use to value power assets. You can perform a sensitivity analysis. You can access electricity prices and also benchmark different power assets. It is custom built for demanding workflows, and we continuously update it. Last slide. And all of this, research and data that we have is supported by a team of over 700 analysts and consultants with offices across the world, especially in key locations that are close to industry clusters. So whether that is in asset valuations, corporate finance, supply chain, power procurement, or project development, our global network helps to provide data insights to over 3,000 customers, ranging from the largest, multinational companies to smaller specialists all over the world. And with that, I'll end my presentation and hand over to Mark for our panel discussion.
Okay. Thank you very much, Robert, and good afternoon, good morning to everybody, wherever you are. So I have the honor today of chairing the panel session. So we have Robert, who will join. We also have Chen Yuan, who is Robert's colleague, and she covers the offshore for Asia Pacific for Wood Mackenzie. We also have my colleague Tang, who's the Vietnam country manager and who comes from Mainstream Renewables, and he covers our Vietnam interests. What I'd like to do is I'd like to try to keep this as interactive as possible. So we're going to do a couple of polls in a minute, but I'd also really encourage you to enter into the chat box any questions that you have. We'll probably get more than we can answer, but we'll certainly try to get through all of them. We want to make sure that we're answering the questions that you all in the market have. So what I'll do is I'm going to ask some questions, but let me just start with one of the polls. So can you see the poll? Robert, can you see the poll?
Is that on Japan offshore?
Yeah, so the poll is on Japan offshore wind auction. And I think as Robert noted, there were some pretty surprising outcomes. There was a pretty surprising outcome. So just we'd like to get an idea. Please vote whether you think it's going to go the next auction. The price from the winning bidders will either go up or stay roughly the same or go down. Oops, I can't see the poll. Eileen, can you launch the poll for me, please? I'll relaunch. I'm relaunching it. Can you see the poll now?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, great. Okay. So please fill in the poll. And so while you're doing that, what I'm going to do is I need to ask Robert about some of the prices, because I'm sure all of you have heard that commodity prices are going up, steel prices, copper prices, rare earth prices, etc. So Robert, I know that in our prep discussion, you said that prices in China are still going to go down. Maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit and how you see prices both in China and in other Asian offshore markets, how you see them going over the next couple of years.
Yeah, so China is still the odd market out. I mean, our China team published an insight on this, and it's even I'm a bit amazed by what's happening. So it's really, for them, it's due to that rush in the policy expiries, and then of that competition being extremely fierce, that people are willing to bid much lower prices compared to other markets, because we are seeing from all the turbine OEMs across the world, the raw material price has gone up. Just it's a fact. But in China, for some reason, China team believes that there's access to very large volumes. They've already locked in prices from ages ago. They can get special prices from state-owned companies, to at least control the prices. So at least, in the short term, that price increase is not as high as compared to other markets. But I'm pretty sure that, China can't maintain this, for the next few years going forward. So we are already getting input from our China team that, some of the raw material price are going up. So you can see that, in the next few years, I think it will be a challenge. They will be facing the similar issues with the other markets in APAC in terms of, trying to control that price. And also for the rest of APAC, I mean, I think, depending on how big your turbine is, how many vessels you plan to use, I think they all face the same issue. So in our LCOE, estimate, at least for next year and also this year, we do expect at least a 15% increase in prices, 15 upwards of 20, depending on the market. So yeah, it's something very, it has to be managed, carefully by all the developers, because we don't want to get the prices so high that, the governments will see that, hey, this is we can't afford it. We'll go back to sticking with gas power.
Right.
Maybe I just can add some comments.
Yes, please.
We do see like the turbine price is surprisingly decreased in China, like another totally different story compared to the other region outside of China. So if we summarize, it can be like two main reasons. So first, it's just the very fierce competition in the China market. Like for China, there's still more than 10 turbine OEMs in the market, which are basically all the domestic focused. And they are like the turbine size is just going larger and larger, and that technology iteration is just also can bring the cost down. But I think the most important, maybe the second reason is like Robert mentioned before, is like the economic of skills. Like China actually has the capability to supply 50% of the whole global wind demand for the supply chain. So actually, WoodMac recently just published a free horizon piece to talk about how China's expanding manufacturing capability gonna impact the energy transition in the globally. So everyone is feel free to join our like a free LinkedIn webinar on 1st of March, to talk more details on that.
Okay, Chen-Yuan, I know you were the author of the recent WoodMac report on Japan offshore wind auction. If you look at the results of the survey, does that surprise you?
I think it's quite evenly distributed actually. So, I think most people, like there's a very positive thing is because everyone believes this the first tender price is just very surprising, and it might be a one exception. And actually, like we analyzed in the report, it's one of the reasons is because the price is just has a much higher weighing than the other factor that is not really the original purpose designed by the government. So I think the government is also actually gonna reviewing the framework and see how to balance between the price and also to facilitate like the local content and also to make sure the projects can actually be executed well. Yeah, because yeah, I mean our view on this first Japan tender is that the execution of these 3 projects gonna be really important. So that the impact gonna be double-edged. Like if the projects can go very well, then it's gonna definitely a good thing for both the industry and the government to showcase that the low offshore wind price gonna increase the competitiveness of offshore wind than all the other energy sources. But on the other hand, if the low price is just become a barrier to actually developing the market or make it happen, that will like change the story.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. Maybe what I'll do is I'll run the next auction. Sorry, I was having a little bit of challenge with my technology. So the next one is on floating. And so the question here is, what will be the total gigawatt of floating offshore that is online in Asia by 2030? And this excludes China, just given the massive scale of China. So this is going to check, Robert, your the slide that you showed to see how many people agree.
Oh no, yeah, we removed that slide.
Yeah,
but
yeah. Anyway, so an interesting comments here. So maybe while we do this, I'll ask Tong. The Vietnam market has gotten a huge amount of interest lately, and at the end of October last year, the onshore FIT expired. What do you think is going to happen to those many projects that missed the deadline? Because everybody's asking about that, because it's multiple gigawatts, and the investors have already spent quite a bit of money and did not get any relief. So any thoughts on what's going to happen to those projects?
Yes, thanks, Mark. By the end of October last year, there are nearly 4 gigawatts of projects make it to the FIT deadline. And also there are more than 4 gigawatts that actually miss it. So those projects are now looking for the government to come up with a new mechanism for the project to be COD or to be, to be able to sell the electricity to EVN or to the system. What we have seen in the market so far is just a matter of 2 or 3 weeks ago, the government has come up with a new transition mechanism for the project that already missed the FIT deadline to be able to negotiate directly with EVN one by one. And that's a new draft document from the ministry, MOIT. It comes with about 30 pages, nearly 30 pages of very complicated point by point for each project to negotiate directly with EVN in terms of how to come up with a FIT for each project. The challenge for it is so the target for each project to get the IRR, the target IRR is 12%, and we think that that document is too complicated, and it gives it could give the project investor very little leverage when negotiate with EVNs, because when they start the negotiation, they actually need to connect their project with almost built, or some projects are in construction, or some projects already finished construction, and the negotiation could take months or even years, and it gives the project's owner very little leverage. And the thinking that we got from MIT is that after this transition mechanism that they just proposed, they will come to auction for onshore wind, and that is the mindset of the government for the moment. So technically, yeah, a lot of problem for those projects right now, and we are monitoring the situation, but some people are already approaching MIT to request a extension for the FIT, but I don't think that's going to happen. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds challenging for some of the investors, maybe even the banks. So looking at the results of the survey, everybody is quite optimistic, or the majority are quite optimistic. So Robert and Chen Yuan, do you have any views on the optimism in the audience?
I mean, I'm not surprised. We are seeing the momentum build up, in terms of how many alliances there are and to do, floating offshore in Apac. So it's not shown in the presentation, but previously we had a slide that showed that, back in 2018, there was only about 8 alliances that was doing offshore, trying to do floating offshore. But then by the end of last year, we, was more than tripled. It's about 30 alliances doing offshore. And Sonia can also mention and talk about this. When we track the pipeline of floating offshore projects in Asia Pacific, I think South Korea has one of the world's largest pipeline of floating projects in the world. So yeah, that's very promising, despite the fact that there is still no floating offshore projects like operationally large scale in the rest of APEC.
Yeah, Chen Yuan, any thought?
Yeah, just as Robert mentioned, like in 2021, there's total like 30 offshore alliances, and among of that, 80% of them are about floating. So you can see floating is really a hot topic, attracting lots of interest now. And we are also seeing like markets already trying to initiating some government movement, like in Taiwan, like for the next round tender or auction, like developers are not only want bottom fixed projects, they're also planning some floating projects. And also we see a lot of pipeline in South Korea and even in Australia. Even the market still not have like anything firm yet, but the pipeline for floating is already like over 12 gigawatts.
Yeah, I think
so
go ahead. No, I'm just going to say that it has to be, yeah, I think one of the key risks is we have to prove that the concept works. So we have demonstration units in Japan that have been built, historically. Half of them were, I mean, one performed spectacularly, one failed spectacularly. So it's it needs to show that, what is the key technology that will be used? Can it be supported by local industry clusters? And also, and are there any support from the government? Because this is, again, floating offshore wind is a new segment within offshore wind itself. So how comfortable developers are in, building large-scale projects immediately without that track record in APEC, and also the government, they might be a bit cautious about this.
Okay, so just to maybe switch a little bit to Southeast Asia. So we've talked a lot about Northeast Asia doing floating. Philippines is actually thinking of, in doing floating, just given, the seabed characteristics of the Philippines. Does Wood Mackenzie have any view on the prospects for floating in the Philippines? And if so, when does it come on?
Yeah, I guess as Robert mentioned, policy and certainty is definitely the thing, like have to be there in the first place. I know that Philippines is now taking a lot of active, positive move, like they're trying to work with GWAC to building like the offshore roadmap. Hopefully we can see that coming out in the first half of this year. And we will see how the government's gonna be, like what kind of support scheme gonna be used, not only for floating, but also for like the bottom fixed offshore. So I think, something is definitely about the geography nature. Like that's also something happened in South Korea, because like the moderate wind speed in South Korea is just split the market like into 2 parts. like in the east part, you have to go to floating because that's where you have a higher wind speed, but also very, very deep water depth. And so if Philippines has that nature, that's one thing, but still the policy framework and the government supports will be another key.
Yeah, and also we have to be recognizant of the fact that Philippines gets hit by typhoons all the time, so it's a very regular occurrence, and that's so we need to see whether the turbines are also up to spec. They can handle not just normal typhoon conditions in Taiwan, but also typhoon conditions in the Philippines as well.
Okay, let's take a couple of questions from the audience. One is, what are the average turbine sizes, megawatts and rotors, that can be expected for installation in Apac? So, pick a year, say 2030. What are the typical sizes that are going to be installed? You can say China and ex-China if you want.
I mean, yeah, if we're talking about, okay, let's say Apac in general, because we saw the news recently that DEC, as I mentioned, they're going to issue a 30 megawatt turbine. So if we're talking about offshore wind, I think we're really clearly looking at around 12 megawatt plus range as an average size. And then in terms of the rotors, I think over 200 meters. But we have a dedicated technology team that actually forecasts this out. I mean, I can check with them, but this is just my just the hot take.
Okay.
Yeah, like for offshore, what we're seeing now in like the latest Japan projects, they're like 12.6 megawatt turbine. And also in Taiwan, they're already like Siemens Gamesa and Vestas, they're also building like the 14 megawatt facility. Yeah, that's the current trend. But I mean, yeah, the overall trend is definitely going larger.
Okay. Another question, which is a little bit more controversial, it says, outside of China, OEMs and EPCIs are losing a lot of money on offshore wind. Sapporo walked away from a project in Taiwan. Saipem have announced a major financial hit. How's it? And I know that the OEMs have all come out and said they're facing very, very, very strong cost pressures because of commitments that they've made a couple of years ago in bids that they now have to deliver in today's high price environment. How do you think the industry is going to address these elevated costs, and what do you think will be the outcome?
Yeah, that's a tough question, because the demand is obviously there. I mean, obviously, if one of a company drops out, I think there's so much demand to build these projects in Taiwan, and so many companies looking to expand into offshore wind that some company will jump in. Also, potentially, if you exclude Taiwan, like Chinese companies will look to jump in and offer a more cost-effective solution. So it's a very fierce competition. I think in general, it's good in terms the government will see this as, okay, that drives more competition. But in terms of ensuring a sustainable market, I think for developers this is a problem, because obviously these cost issues will just lead to project delays, and project delays leads to cost increases, and cost increases inevitably pushes away the government regulators.
Yeah, just add one small comment. Maybe my key takeaway is that offshore industry is a very, how to say, like attractive market, but it's come with risk, So, I mean, it's also kind of reflected. If you're adding local content on that, it's going to make it more challenging. So now we're still kind of Taiwan is quite open market, so they're using all kind of international companies now. But now with the next round, stage 3 tender auction, I mean the increasing requirements on the local content, I think it's just give us some like things think ahead. Like, do we really have that capability, or can we, like the local supply chain can keep up with the demanding of the project coming online?
Yeah, and I think it's important. Sorry, no, I'm just going to say it's important. Like GWIC, you need to lobby the government, make sure they understand the risk that are involved in offshore wind, and also don't ensure there's actually fair competition, and also there's there's space for even international companies to operate in the market. I mean, it's one aspect we really want to see that can really drive offshore growth is that coordination between different markets, between different players, different developers, turbine suppliers, supply chain that we see in Europe that really helps to really drive that price down, plus that support from the government. So you really need that coordination between all these core players. Yeah.
Okay.
Really
So you both mentioned supply chain, and there's one question that would be interested to hear the panel's view on supply chain, like yards, ship, people, and the capability to accommodate the growth. So, and I know this is a key issue in every market. And Tong, I know we were talking about this, I think just yesterday with one of our members. You want to talk about sort of the prospects for, the supply chain, ports, infrastructure, people, et cetera, enabling the offshore in Vietnam?
Yes, I think that supply chain is definitely going to be a big problem when we go to offshore. Let's take onshore for a second. When the onshore boom happened in 2021 and 2020, there's a huge demand for a supply chain in Vietnam, where the industry has just started. So cranes, logistic, and even workforce, things like that are all lacking. And I have heard from a lot of investors that they had to pay an extremely high amount of money for international suppliers for that. When it comes to offshore, the problem become even more complicated because it involves ships, port, and bigger cranes that can operate in the sea, and the technical skill folks, technical skill workforce are also more complicated, and I believe that supply chain is going to be a huge problem when we come to offshore. And if the government want to meet the target for offshore wind, they need to very carefully study the supply chain and have a plan to develop the supply chain, and in advance, not along the way with the target for offshore wind. Supply chain needs to start first, and I think that probably going to be a same problem for many countries in Southeast Asia, again outside of China also, where the offshore industry for oil and gas also in many countries are not as developed. It will take quite some time to develop supply chain, and it needs to be addressed carefully by the government in order to meet that target for offshore wind. Yeah.
Okay, Chen Yuan and Robert, any comments on sort of supply chain development, from various markets, from Korea, Japan, Taiwan, even Philippines?
Yeah, I mean, I think offshore wind is never only about the technology or power supply. I think every market is targeting it as a decarbonization method, and as well as a job creation and a way for stimulating economics. So everyone wants to build their own supply chain to have their own local economics growth. But I mean, that's a good thing to do, but sometimes we need to think about like how to make some synergy like between different markets, instead of everyone has their own totally whole supply chain built. That's not the most beneficial for everyone, right? So I definitely can understand why all the markets is having this policy or framework or going to have, but they really need to like balance between how to make it still competitiveness and to allow the industry growth, and to make sure that there's room for price reduction, and at the same time to have built some local content.
Okay. Robert, any further thoughts on that? Oh, Tom?
Yes, I think that's one more point is probably the same mindset from every government that looking at offshore wind right now is they want to have a part or a big part of local content in that. But not every country going to be able to produce turbines. Not every country going to have a big, a lot of ships in order to supply that. But I think each country will have to select is like the part of supply chain for offshore wind that they want to participate, and they need to choose it wisely in order to make it happen. Or else, if one country want to do everything, it's not realistic in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's also probably why we're seeing South Korea trying to ramp up floating offshore ahead of everybody else. So I think it's also they're trying to force the market to accept that, if you want to do floating offshore wind, there's only really one market that you should be looking at. But at the same time, it's hard to coordinate because China, you have this giant market in China, which also has a very established offshore supply chain across the entire, not just within turbines, but across the entire supply chain. And they're pushing to sell their products across Apac as well. So at the end of the day, it's also an issue of, for the government, the priority is a price or you want localization. You can't really have both at the same time. I mean, if you can try, but it'll just take a bit longer for offshore wind to really kick off.
Okay, another question just came in related to this. It says a bit of background. It's not really happening yet, and this should be made clear. This comment, the following comment, should be made clear to politicians. Not all countries can both have a high content and become a major exporter, which is true. I think that reinforces, I think, what you've just said. But then there's another comment that to make the supply chain really, feasible in the long term, it has to be self-sustaining. And what can the industry do to kind of make? We know there's a need for government support. We prefer not to have high local content requirements specified or exact types of components specified like Taiwan did. But what can the industry itself do to ensure that the supply chain is more sustainable than it is right now? That's a hard question.
Yeah, I mean, from what the developers have told us in the past, it's also a case of the volume. If you can guarantee your market will be adding at least a gigawatt every year, then of course the supply chain companies like, okay, can you show me the policy, the support mechanisms you have in place, and also any incentives you have, so that we feel more comfortable in setting up our supply chain in your market. So we do see some competition between all the different markets, but it's still at an early stage, I feel.
Yeah. Anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, no, I think like Robert is right. I carefully designed route to market is very important to attract supply chain, because for any company to set up a supply chain in a new market, they need to see the potential, they need to see the commitment from the government, a clear policy roadmap or something like that. See what happened in UK, for example. It took 10 years to make the country have a very strong supply chain for offshore wind right now, and that could happen, but it needs to be done very, very carefully.
Yeah. So that, and by the way, if for those of you who don't know, this is what GWEC spends pretty much every waking hour of every day doing, really trying to get regulatory consistency, continuity across the policy, across the countries, etc. So let's turn to one of our favorite topics, the grid and curtailment and grid upgrades to keep up with these what are typically very large offshore projects. Do you have any thoughts about the curtailment risk of projects across countries? It's been especially acute or challenging in Vietnam, just given the 20 gigawatts of wind and solar that were added in the last 3 years in Vietnam. But I mean, maybe I'll let Tom start with that, but what's the answer to this? Is it private investment in transmission infrastructure, or what is it? What's the solution here? Because it's always a question, it's always a challenge. Tom, maybe you start.
Yeah, I think you you just gave the answer in the
Sorry.
question there. So,
Sorry.
yeah. So again, like I'm gonna give people who doesn't know about well the situation in Vietnam a very quick summary. Is over the last 3 years there are more than 20 gigawatts of wind and solar added into the grid, and obviously most of those gigawatts actually, like more than 90% of them focus in the south part of the country. So there's not enough grid for to take in all of that. And the utility even I think similar to any utility we cannot build the grid fast enough. And that's one option that the Vietnamese government is discussing right now, is letting the private sector to come in to build the grid for and then transfer it to the government to operate. The reason for that is currently, according to the law in Vietnam, only the government utility EVN can build and operate the grid due to national security. So letting private sector coming in and build the grid is what I think is a good idea. They need to change the law a little bit for that, and they need a mechanism to come up with that, like what the fee the government are willing to pay to private sector in building the grid. And especially when we're talking about offshore wind, again, letting a private sector build the grid is one thing, but also they need to have a very concrete plan to build the grid. Like in Vietnam, most of renewable energy by wind, and what I mean is wind and solar focus in the south, but for the next 10 years, the demand going to be in the north, going to be higher in the north. So long line transmission are needed, high voltage. Some people are talking about, you know, HVDC, a line along the coast of Vietnam to transmit power from the south to the north. That's one solution. It's not cheap. It's not easy to do, but I think it's feasible if the government really put a focus on it. Yeah, that's a Vietnam example. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, yes, yeah, I think Tang pointed out very well. Like, yeah, one thing is just liberalize the market and to allow private investment. And another thing maybe like Taiwan can be a good example here. Like, for example, in the next stage 3, you have to apply with the Thai Power for your grid allocation capacity first to get the permission, and then you're allowed to go into the participation for the tender auction. Yeah, I think Thai Power also, like in the very beginning, I think when they started this 3 stages offshore development plan, Thai Power also already started like the upgrading or the build out of the grid to keep up with this offshore plan. And I think, yeah, another thing maybe if the market is not that liberalized, if the grid sector is still like monopoly by the state-owned utility, then I think there has to be some government support to put on some motivation for this big state utility to take some actions. I think there's a good sign in South Korea recently, like the government is actually asking Capco to do the investment first. Like it's not about the long-term transmission network. It's about like the connection part from the offshore wind to the existing onshore grid connection point. So that part was supposed to be the developer's responsibility, but then that's adding another burden and risk for the developer, right? So actually government is pushing Capco to build that part first, and then they can be shared later from all the developers that will use this network and to pay back to Capco. So I think there's a lot of innovation or other business model we can try to work on.
Okay, good. Robert, any final comments?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like because of the costs involved in offshore wind, but also because of the better performance of offshore wind compared to other renewables. We're talking about capacity factors that are 40, 50, even maybe 60% in the future. There should be a special carve out for offshore wind if you can make the case to the government. And also, it's also the fact that offshore wind power plants are not located like in mountains, like what Tang has mentioned, requiring hundreds of miles of cables. It's located close to the power demand areas, so the distances should be relatively shorter compared to trying to get power from low wind speed sites and also getting a lot of curtailment. That there are benefits to offshore wind over onshore wind, and that should be to express to the government, and then to make sure that they can understand what are the benefits of offshore wind, and there should be some kind of support mechanisms for that grid infrastructure.
Okay. I'm getting notice from Eileen that we need to end and go into the networking session. But I just want to say very special thanks to Robert, Chen Yuan, and Tang. I found this very useful and enlightening, and I hope the audience has found it helpful. And again, just thanks to everybody. Thanks to our members, and we look forward to the next Asian Focus webinar. Cheers. Have a good day, everybody. All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hi. Thank you, everyone, for the excellent discussion. Thank you, Mark.